and tonight's subject is curlews and energy production. And actually, it's rather a good sort of night to be doing it on because it's very, very cold. There's not a lot of wind. I think when I checked an hour ago, only 14% of the UK's energy was renewable today. I had to wait until a few minutes ago to make my cup of tea because we were asked by our power company not to use anything. So we've got a long way to go. In order to meet our stated aim of net zero by 2050, that 14%'s got to get way, way up further than that. And the interesting thing about it is you've got all these issues going on, like climate change, like biodiversity loss, like water shortage and all the rest of it. But really only climate change has got the microphone at the moment. And I think we all get that. And by and large, that's fine, because what is good for climate change mitigation tends to be quite good for all the other things. What generally, but not exclusively. So, for example, with curlews, we know that planting blocks of trees is not good on curlew breeding grounds, is not good for curlew breeding. With renewables, there are issues like, which we'll come on to this evening, like birds flying into turbines, disturbance of migrating fish. And actually, even today, a wildlife trust has begun a court action challenging a wind farm in Aberdeenshire because it's going to disturb wildcats. So mammals are involved as well. But tonight we're going to talk about curlews. And as always, we feel very privileged as this sort of tiny little charity. We've got a fantastic, I hesitate to use the word stellar, but hey, stellar cast of panel. Chris Baines is the independent chair of the National Grid Stakeholder Advisory Group. What Chris spends his life doing is making sure there are biodiversity gains for where we bring cabling on shore, where we put pylons down and replace them with cabling. So he does this all the time, and he's going to be kicking us off. We have Philipp Schwemmer, who is the senior scientist of the Research and Technical Centre at Kiel University in Germany. And what he's going to talk about is the behavioural and spatial changes that he has specifically studied of migrating curlews in the Baltic as relates to offshore wind farms. And then Sam Franks, we're particularly grateful to Sam because she stepped in at the last minute because our previous speaker is on their sickbed. Many of you will know her. She's senior ecologist and scientist leading the BTO, that's British Trust for Ornithology, WADA breeding programme. And she's going to talk a little more close to home about curlews and touch on something that the missing speaker was going to talk about, which was the barrage, the proposed barrage over the Wash. That's enough of me. We're going to have the three talks. Put your questions in the chat, and then we'll have a good free-for-all after that. And just to re-echo what Megan said, we're a tiny charity. Even fivers and tenors do us good. So if you do feel like donating afterwards, please do so. Without further ado, Chris, can I ask you to climb in?
Thank you. I'm not a curlew specialist, not a curlew expert, but curlews have been a really important part of my life for all of my life. I grew up on the edge of Sheffield, and so the Peak District was on my doorstep, and unquestionably it was the walks through the moorland of the Peak District with the soundtrack of curlews that shaped my early life. And I've always worked as an environmentalist, but I've also always worked with industry. So I've played a really enjoyable role, I suppose, at the interface between industry, government and the not-for-profit sector. I'm very involved with the wildlife trusts and other nature conservation organisations. And I'm old enough to actually remember Peter Scott's BBC wildlife programmes in black and white, where the soundtrack, the signature tune was curlews. So I have a long history of a love of these birds. But for the last 10 years, I've been chairing the stakeholder advisory group for the national grid. And it's that role and the potential it offers for beginning to restore and rebuild the landscapes that the Curlews depend upon that I want to talk about for the next few minutes. And the stakeholder advisory group was set up at the behest of Ofgem, the government regulator, to steer the way in which the national grid spent hundreds of millions of pounds on reducing the visual impact of pylons and overhead lines, particularly in national parks and in areas of outstanding natural beauty. So for 10 years, this group of people has been working with the national grid, and I like to think kind of developing a really creative relationship. And the mixture of organisations is interesting. The people who sit on my advisory group are all at chief executive or similar levels, so very senior professionals, but from a mixture of government agencies, Natural England, for instance, Cadw in Wales, Historic England, and also the major landscape-based not-for-profit organisations, the charities. So the National Trust, CPRE, the Ramblers Association. It's a really interesting mixture of people. And for the most part, what we've been doing is working in extremely sensitive landscapes. We've carefully chosen the most difficult landscapes for the National Trust, for the National Grid to work in. This is just one example. This is the east of the Peak District, the headwaters of the River Don, and unquestionably Curlew country. If you stand there, you hear curlews constantly. And what we've been doing is working with National Grid to help them to remove pylons in this particular instance, but to do it in a sensitive way that does minimum damage to the landscape and to the wildlife that lives there. So over the last 10 years, we've actually seen pylons disappear from the Dorset Downs, from the Peak District. They're soon to disappear from North Wiltshire, the Cotswolds, and actually in Snowdonia, a major project to underground the pylons that are there at the moment, right underneath one of the tidal estuaries. So spectacular work. But I wanted to mention this particular project because this has really sensitive ecological risks associated with it, and in particular this little bird, the willow tit, which is even more endangered than curlews are, 96% loss in the last 50 years. And I argued from the beginning that if National Grid really was skillful and sensitive, then the habitat of the willow tit could be enhanced by the process of removing the pylons. And that's precisely what's happened. From an early stage where the Yorkshire Wildlife Trusts were opposing the programme of pylon removal because of the threat that it posed to the willow tit and its habitat, that same Yorkshire Wildlife Trust is now working with the National Grid on education programmes, because what's happened is that the willow tit population hasn't just survived through the process of undergrounding, but has actually thrived. And in the process of removing the pylons, National Grid has been able to enhance the wildlife habitat for this particular bird. So we've had 10 years of that kind of experience, which is extremely encouraging, I think. And now we're being asked to work with them on the very, very ambitious, huge programme of new infrastructure that is actually being generated by the need to shift from coal-fired energy production to particularly offshore renewable energy. So this is a very auspicious moment really for a massive restructuring of the National Grid, the energy distribution network. And it comes at a time when actually we've just had the UK State of Nature report published, a state of the nature and how it's changed between 1970 and 2023, almost exactly my working lifespan. And that has shown that there has been a catastrophic loss, not just of curlews, but for instance, a 60% decline in farmland birds in that 50 odd years. So nobody really can say that if the landscape ain't broke, don't fix it. The landscape that we're dealing with is broke. It's been devastatingly damaged by a whole range of activities over that period. And it's not just that we've lost the habitats, although the habitats have disappeared. These are just 3 of the habitats that curlews depend upon. So the salt marsh and the tidal mudflats, particularly through the winter, the hay meadows in which they can nest and do nest successfully if the hay survives, and then the upland wetlands where they spend much of the summer. All of these habitats have been seriously depleted or seriously damaged over that same 50 odd years. But it's not just the habitat. It's the way in which we've managed the landscape over that period. So since 1970, the style of farming has changed spectacularly. This is just one example, the whole zero grazing, cutting silage a couple of times a year and storing it in big plastic bags. That kind of change in the landscape has made it more and more difficult for a ground nesting bird like the curlew to survive and breed successfully. So in this particular image, it's certainly not the pylon in the background that's caused the curlews great problems. It's the agricultural style in the foreground. In fact, there are places certainly in the intensive agricultural farmland where almost the only recognizable wildlife habitat is that survives at the base of the pylons. And there are 1 or 2 places where curlew are known to have chosen to nest under the pylons because it's the one bit of the landscape that won't be mown out while the nests and the eggs and the chicks are still there. And that whole landscape change, I think, has another strand to it, which is that the landscape has lost its integrity, it's lost its connectedness. So the fragmentation of the landscape, the isolation of pockets of habitat, has really meant that the landscape is no longer viable for many species. If you're a hedgehog trying to get from here to that pond, you'd have one heck of a struggle. And I think we all now understand that it's the lack of integrity, the lack of joining up of the landscape that has really been the death knell for many, many species. And for a species like the curlew that depends on a number of different habitats, they need not just really good nesting sites, but they need good wintering grounds. They need good summer feeding grounds. And we have to begin to think in a much more holistic way about how we rebuild habitats, how we manage the land more sympathetically, but also how we begin to join the landscape back together. And that's where I think that the national grid, the new infrastructure, has a role to play, because over the next 10 or 15 years, we are going to see hundreds of kilometres of new lines of pylons running through the landscape, running through all kinds of landscapes. So certainly through the lowland farming landscape, but also across the upper moorlands, across the wetlands. There's an opportunity for us to work with National Grid to re-wet, to re-establish the wetlands that are so important for the curlews. And even on the coast, this is the Dwyrid estuary in North Wales, where the National Grid are working to remove these pylons. But in many places, the offshore energy is going to be coming ashore and crossing the coast at some point. And there, again, there will be an opportunity to protect and enhance salt marsh and to make sure that those corridors of energy production and energy transmission also become the corridors of habitat restoration, soil recovery, and biodiversity net gain. So what I'm arguing is that this is probably the biggest landscape intervention, certainly in my lifetime. Huge amount of change in the landscape in order to facilitate the shift from carbon-based energy to renewable energy. And that if we can find ways of working with the national grid, then I think we really can start to rebuild the landscape. So we can begin to drive a shift from this kind of unsustainable farming with its soil erosion and its chemicals, to see that disappear and be replaced at least in part, and at least along those corridors of energy transmission, with restored wildlife, with restored habitat, with the kinds of meadows that we know how to recreate because we're doing it here and there through the conservation movement, but on a scale that would actually begin to really bring back the integrity of the landscape and provide the kind of network of habitat that curlews need. We have the building blocks of that because these are the organisations, just to remind you, that are already engaged with the national grid. And I really hope that we can see that as an opportunity to make a significant difference on the back of what is going to be, in any event, a huge national investment in sustainability. Thank you.
Took me by surprise there, Chris. Thanks very much. Can I throw one question at you, just because you say this is a fantastic opportunity for joined up thinking with all the works being done on the grid. Do you get any sense as a national infrastructure project that joined up thinking is happening?
Yes, I do. I think there is a real appetite for it, but it's a very steep learning curve. There is a huge amount of, from the National Grid's point of view, huge amount of just straightforward logistics work to be done. And so they have to be kind of doubly energized to want to talk about renewable agriculture or, you know, any of the other issues that would have seemed tangential until now. But I think as a measure of their appetite, I've got a meeting in a couple of weeks' time with the senior engineers from the east of England. Are meeting with a group of farmers from the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association, and that's at the grid's request. They're asking if we can actually arrange for them to meet some of those people that they want to use as the role models for all the other people they're going to have to deal with over the next few years. And it's much more broad than that. One of the most exciting things for me this last month or so is that I took my committee to the tunnels that the National Grid is digging under London. And because we're doing some tunnelling under the Dwyrid estuary in North Wales, in Snowdonia, for instance, to underground the cables there. And the introduction to the whole visit had its usual health and safety 5 minutes, which is all about, you know, avoid reversing vehicles and all that kind of thing. But most remarkably, I would think they spent 10 minutes talking about mental health and the fact that there are 2 suicides a week in the construction industry. And so as a company, really passionate about mental health amongst their workers. And that left me thinking, well, actually, the other big industry that has a serious suicide problem is farming. And so now the National Grid and the farmers are beginning to collaborate over the whole business of mental health, because if you're a farmer on the edge, then the last thing you need is the threat of the National Grid coming across your farm with pylons. So there is a real sense that they want to engage in a much more broad way and learn and listen, and then use the influence they've got and the massive amount of money that's going to be spent on the new infrastructure to leave a very much broader lasting legacy.
Well, that's brilliant. Thanks very much, Chris. And just one thing, Chris mentioned the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association, PFLA. If you haven't heard of it, check it out on the website. They're doing very quietly. They're doing a great job. Now, Sam, we're going to slightly change the order. And Sam from the BTO, are you there? And would you like to get going?
Hi, thanks, Roger. Thanks for your patience. I got roped into this about 6 hours ago, and I pulled together a bunch of slides for mostly other people. Hopefully you can see that now. If you can give me a thumbs up, Roger, can you see a presentation? Excellent, good stuff. Rightio. So yeah, as Roger said in my introduction, I'm a senior research ecologist at BTO with a wetland and marine team. Some of you who've been to these webinars before might know me talking about breeding waders, but a lot of the work that my team actually does focuses on the marine environment, and particularly interactions with marine seabirds and the renewable offshore industry. And we're only just starting to look at the potential impact of offshore wind, in particular, on smaller species and seabirds, or ones which are only temporarily in the marine environment, that is, migrants. Looking at water birds and potentially even down the road, smaller terrestrial landbird migrants, which are crossing the North Sea and others of our seas twice annually on their migrations. But obviously this is going to be focusing mainly on curlews. So as you probably all know, if you've been to the estuaries anywhere around the UK this winter, the UK hosts internationally significant and protected estuaries for hundreds of thousands of wintering water birds from across northern and western Europe. And we're a major stop on the East Atlantic Flyway, among others, but also connecting flyways across right into North America and Iceland and Greenland as well. So this is just a bit of a highlight of some of the major estuaries in England and in Wales. I've highlighted in particular in turquoise, in the sort of middle right of the screen, is the Wash, which is an estuary that is particularly dear to my heart, as you will hear shortly. So my day job is with the BTO, but in my spare time, because I'm a glutton for punishment, possibly, or type 2 fun, I'm also a member of the last 10 years of the Wash Wader Research Group, which has been studying waders on the Wash since 1959, so over 60 years now. It's a family affair, so we all go, including my now 6.5-year-old daughter, who helps out as part of the team now that she's a bit older. And the Wash Wader Research Group has been involved in various activities on the Wash for 60 years, developing a lot of the methods involved with both cannon netting and mist netting waders, both in the UK, and have also transmitted a lot of that knowledge abroad as well. So our activities include mainly ringing, but have evolved over the years to include other activities as well, which are really important at monitoring the wader populations in the Wash, looking at how those have changed over time, and the impacts of various environmental factors, but also anthropogenic causes of that might influence waders as well, including recreational disturbance and weather events, and potentially renewable developments as well. So our activities are largely carried out on the beaches and the salt marshes around the Wash. All the members of the group are volunteers, and more recently, instead of just ringing, we have also been developing some of the work that we do to involve colour marking birds and reciting them afterwards, to look at their movements around the Wash and how well they survive, and have also expanded our work into GPS tracking as well. So the first bit that I'm going to talk about is a little bit of a joint effort, collaborative effort between the Wash Group, the BTO, and numerous other collaborators working on curlews across Europe. And Philipp is also going to be talking about this same data set, which is a phenomenal GPS tracking data set for wader curlew researchers across Europe who have been GPS tracking curlews for about 7 years now. From a variety of different European countries. And this is work that myself and my colleague Chris Thaxter at the BTO are leading on, but obviously with the involvement of a number of other researchers across Europe who've been involved in the data collection. And specifically, it's looking at the migration behavior of Eurasian curlew and Eurasian oystercatcher, so a little bit of a non-curlew wader species there, in the North Sea in terms of their implications of their migration for interactions with offshore wind farms. So this is a fairly new bit of work that we've been working on for the last 4 to 6 months or so. And just in terms of a little bit of background, in terms of the wind energy sector in the UK, there's obviously been a continued expansion of offshore wind energy to meet clean energy targets and net zero by 2050. In the North Sea in particular, as well as the Irish Sea, English Channel, various other bits of UK waters are key to achieving this, but the North Sea in particular. And offshore wind farms, not only for marine seabird species, but also for migratory birds, poses a potential collision risk and a barrier, a geographic barrier to migration. And while a lot of research and effort has been put into understanding the potential interactions of largely marine species like seabirds and gulls with offshore wind, there's a much greater need for understanding how these sort of twice annual movements as part of migratory species life cycles might interact with offshore wind. So this is just a zoomed in map of the current and prospective potential wind farm developments in the North Sea and in various other seas in Western and Northern Europe. And you can see that there's quite a lot of activity planned for both English waters and Scottish waters, as well as, waters bordering the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, and so on. So the North Sea is a hotbed of offshore wind energy development, and obviously is a very important migratory flyway for species which are migrating across from Northern Europe and from other parts of Western Europe to spend winter on our shores here in the UK. So the two species we looked at as part of the study were Eurasian curlew and oystercatcher. As I mentioned, both of these are near threatened wader species that have declining populations across the East Atlantic flyway. And among migratory species, they could pose and be at potential significant risk from offshore wind developments. And that risk is perhaps greater than at other times of year. For example, we know from work that our Director of Science, James Pearce-Higgins, did back in the late 2000s that curlews do avoid turbines on breeding grounds. That's not to say that there aren't other disturbance implications, but I'm not really going to touch on that in this particular presentation. So the work involved using GPS tracking data, very high resolution GPS tracking data for both oystercatchers and curlews. And the curlew data set is quite a lot larger than the oystercatcher one because, as I mentioned, it involves a large group of collaborators across Europe who are all GPS tagging curlews for various reasons, but have pooled our collective resources to create this really fantastic and very rich data set. So just as a little summary of some of the tracking data in terms of a spatial overview, you'll see a very similar map from Philipp, but he'll be talking about, I'm hoping anyways, the interactions at a very small scale with individual wind farms, whereas I'm going to be talking about the movements of curlews in a very big picture across the North Sea, rather than at an individual wind farm scale. So most of the movements, as you can see through here for curlews, are across the southern North Sea, with a few northerly routes as well, but many coastal routes, particularly along the Wadden Sea and French coasts. Oystercatchers take a more northerly direction on their routes from the east coast of the UK up to Norway, but it's quite limited sample size, so we're a bit restricted by where the birds were caught in the first place, so there's some bias there. And if we look at a sort of concentration of the area use of curlews in the North Sea, you can see generally across the North Sea, there's quite a broad migratory front shown by the overall scale of the lightest colour of blue, but that darkest shade of blue is really concentrated along the coast of Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, and so on. And so plenty of scale for interaction with offshore wind farms. The timing that birds move through this space is really important because that obviously has implications for potential mitigation measures that offshore wind developers can use in terms of times when turbines can lie quiet versus be active. And this is in terms of both the seasonal timing, but also the diurnal timing as well, so day versus night migration. So that is something that we were looking at, whether or not there's particular peaks in migration across the seasons, which there seems to be two peaks on the spring migration, migrating from west to east across the North Sea, but largely a single peak with a bit of a tail for the autumn migration when curlews are coming back to winter in the UK. With the end of the tail probably being more either successful breeders and or mixed up with a few juveniles. And this is similar to work that Philipp did looking at kind of similar patterns for movements in the Baltic Sea rather than the North Sea. Another really important factor for interaction potential interaction with wind farms is what height migratory birds are flying at, and is there potential, are they flying over turbines? So is that not going to be a problem at all? Or are they going to be flying at sort of rotor swept height, which potentially puts them at greater risk of collision with turbines? And both curlews and oyster catchers fly smack kind of at rotor swept height, between 200 and 300 meters as the average on their migrations. So overall, generally speaking, but this is dependent on various factors, which I'll mention later, puts them at definitely potential risk of collision with offshore wind. So one of the things that can also influence the potential for the collision of birds with offshore wind is environmental conditions that they encounter during migration, which affects things like their flight height, like their speed, whether or not they have a tailwind or whether they're experiencing a headwind or a crosswind or so on. So that was one of the things we wanted to look at, because if there is an interaction in certain conditions, there's again the potential for offshore wind developers to mitigate those potential impacts by shutting down turbines in conditions that would put birds at greater risk of collision because of the heights or the speed or so on at what they're flying at. So in general, at higher wind speeds, birds decreased their flight heights, which is perhaps not a big surprise, and they increased their heights with a tailwind. Again, perhaps not a big surprise. And again, increase the speed at which they fly with increasing tailwind. So they're being wind assisted, which also isn't a great surprise at all. But there wasn't a clear difference that they were doing different things in terms of these environmental conditions, if they were migrating during the day versus at night, or in an easterly or westerly direction. So I've just kind of very briefly touched on some of the findings that we've had from this bit of work. I said that there was quite a lot of implications in terms of potential mitigation strategies, in terms of where wind farms are sited, away from the core range of migration. Of course, we have less indication that curlews are using the northern North Sea to migrate between the UK and Northern Europe, for example, but we equally don't have a lot of birds tagged which are wintering on, for example, the northern Scottish estuaries like the Moray Firth or the Firth of Forth. So filling in that that sort of spatial gap is quite high on our priority list. And then again, as a potential mitigation strategy, curtailing operations to avoid peak periods either seasonally or in certain environmental conditions as well. So turning a little bit to wearing my WASH Wader Research Group hat instead of my BTO hat. The WASH SPA is England's largest estuarine complex and protected area, and its vast mudflats are covered and uncovered by the tide every 12 hours, and there's nearly 500,000 water birds in terms of the peak count that spend the non-breeding season on the WASH. So there's obviously it's an estuary that's of huge importance, both in the UK but also internationally as well, hosting birds during the wintering season from all over Europe. And of course, as a result of this, there are potential huge implications of both estuarine and marine infrastructure development, like wind farms and tidal energy. So that's kind of in the estuarine marine environment. I'll just briefly touch on the fact that there's some species like curlews in particular, which are protected species on the WASH, which also not only use the estuarine habitat during their sort of daily cycle on the WASH, but also spend a lot of time using terrestrial habitats like fields and grasslands around the WASH. And obviously, while these sites aren't necessarily directly impacted by offshore marine or estuarine developments like tidal energy or offshore wind, there is the potential in due course, if onshore wind kind of comes back onto the government agenda, for potential impact there, but also all of the infrastructure that surrounds the sort of estuarine marine infrastructure development side of things, like roads and power grid infrastructure and so on, which could potentially have implications for the terrestrial habitats that some of these species like curlews occupy as well. And I'll point out that none of this terrestrial habitat is actually, it's considered outside of the bounds of the special protected area. So in fact, it's not actually protected as part of the SPA status, despite the fact that it's used extensively by particular species like curlews. So the Wash has recently been nominated as part of the East Coast Flyway of the UK as a tentative site for inclusion of World Heritage status. Many of you will have seen this bit of news last year. And this is particularly important in the context of this, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, a very controversial plan to put a tidal barrage on the Wash, which includes a road connecting Skegness with Hunstanton, among other things, and a large deep sea container terminal. So I should add, so this is the mission statement, if you like, of the company that has proposed this plan to build a tidal barrage on the Wash. To provide guardianship of the ecology of the Wash and fenlands is sort of number one on this list, as well as obviously contributing climate change, flood protection to houses and commercial developments and so on in the fens, and obviously contributing to move towards net zero. But this isn't the first time the Wash has had a plan for a tidal barrage on it. If any of you are familiar with the Wash, you might be familiar with these very strange little donut-shaped structures, which you can see on the satellite imagery. This is the Great Ooze on the right-hand side of the screen, and then the Neen coming out on the left-hand side of the screen here. And we have the inner bund here on the right-hand side, and then the outer bund here on the left-hand side. These are quite odd structures that were created in the late 60s and early 70s as part of a proposal to turn the southern half of the Wash into a freshwater reservoir to supply water to London and the southeast by building a tidal barrage. And these outer trial and inner trial banks were built to test the feasibility of different construction methods. As part of this, there were a range of ecological studies, and the Wash Water Research Group provided a lot of information on the origins and different populations of birds using the Wash, the turnover of birds using the Wash, how they moved around the estuaries, estimates of the total number of individuals using it. And a lot of that information was completely unknown before the Wash studies, and contributed to one of the reasons why this plan was abandoned, other than the fact that it was sort of economically totally unfeasible. The idea of a tidal barrage on the Wash came around again in the late 1980s, where one of the government departments at the time undertook investigations of all possible estuaries in terms of their potential for tidal development. But the Wash didn't get considered in much detail because it had low tidal range, a really wide entrance for the volume of water moving in and out, and therefore there would be a very high cost of construction and a lack of a business case for a road link between two areas with fairly low population density, being Lincolnshire and Norfolk. So these are kind of some of the same arguments that are coming back into play again in terms of this new proposal for the Wash Barrage. This is kind of just a picture of what the outer trial bank looks like, a very odd little place. And in fact, the centre pool is very much saline. It's certainly not at all fresh. So this is just a nice schematic based on some remote sensing data created by my husband, who's sitting across the table, which he put together showing the different heights of mudflats on the Wash. And you can see that it's an incredibly complex landscape hydrologically in terms of geomorphology. And so, you know, I am not a geomorphology expert by any means, but it seems to me like any sort of interference, if you like, in terms of the natural tidal flow in and out of the Wash will have quite a significant impact on changing what is a very, very complex sort of underwater structure and landscape around the Wash, which is really important, obviously, as feeding grounds for a lot of the water birds which spend their time in this environment. And so a lot of the work that the Wash group has been doing, which has kind of been self-directed, has been GPS tagging curlews, looking at their movements around the Wash, both in the terrestrial, between the terrestrial and the estuarine habitats, but also this comes into great importance in terms of their use of the estuarine landscapes in relation to the potential impacts of the Wash Barrage. I am not by any means an expert on the Wash Barrage. I haven't been into any of the town hall meetings or anything like that. And the Wash group generally takes a very similar view to my professional role at the BTO in terms of being non-advocating. So any of the evidence that we provide that might be used down the line as part of an environmental assessment for the Wash Barrage, should it come to that point, will provide information towards understanding the potential impacts of the wash barrage on the ecology of the species using the wash. And that's it for me.
Sam, that's fantastic, and I'm so grateful that you stepped in at the last minute to help us out. And actually, that's brilliant, because I think explaining the wash barrage for beginners, that was beautifully done. So without further ado, Philipp, if you're still there, which I hope you are, would you like to talk?
Thanks a lot. I will share my screen. Yes, thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to present some of our recent work on curlews within this webinar. I'm giving this talk on behalf of a lot of co-authors, which are all acknowledged on my last slide. I apologize a bit that some of my slides are going to repeat a bit what Samantha Franks was already saying, but I think I will present some of these aspects from a bit of another perspective. So I hope it won't disturb you. Well, the intention of our Curlew study, first of all, was, and this was already some years ago, to reveal spatial temporal patterns of curlew migration along the East Atlantic flyway. And we have compiled a large data set for this together with many co-workers. In the second part of my talk, I'm going to present to you some overlaps between areas of main migration intensity and curlew and offshore wind farms, basically in the Baltic Sea. And lastly, I will show you how we assessed possible behavioral reactions of curlews when they approached offshore wind farms. So a study on a very small spatial scale in order to find out how curlew behave when they are really close to the wind farms. These studies were funded by the German Federal Agency for Nature Conservation within the project Bird Move and the follow-up project called TrackBird. Yeah, we are working on curlews using GPS GSM data loggers since 10 years now. And what we are using mainly is the device from the company Ornitella. And this is a GPS GSM data logger, which is solar powered. So we can use a Teflon harness to attach the devices to the birds. And then the energy for the devices come from the sun. So the devices can stay a long time on the birds, and our curlew with, which is like wearing the device as longest of all our curlews, has the device now since I think 7 or 8 years already. So the devices are recording latitude and longitude, time of day, but also the flight speed, the flight altitude, and also the acceleration, which gives us back the activity patterns of the birds. So let's come to the first part of my talk and assess the spatial temporal patterns of migration. Here you can see a compiled data set of French co-workers, of Polish co-workers, and also institutes from south of Germany. And this data set, unfortunately, does not include yet data from the UK, but I think it still represents quite nicely how the migration patterns along the East Atlantic flyway look like. You can see here in black dots the stopover sites of the curlews, and they are mainly located in the Wadden Sea region of Germany and the Netherlands, but also in the southern Baltic Sea region. All the curlews that we have been tagging so far, virtually all of them were breeding in the western part of Russia and some minor proportions also in Finland. Let's have a look at the temporal aspect of curlew migration. This animation here shows when a curlew migration begins, and this is basically an early March with curlews wintering in southern Europe. Then the birds in the La Rochelle region start their migration in about mid of April, and then the Wadden Sea birds follow at around late April, early May. And all the birds, as I said, go more or less, all of them go to the western part of Russia in order to breed there. And then already during early June, yeah, the females and the non-successful breeders start their autumn migration. And yeah, the males then follow together with the juveniles. And yeah, during mid of July, end of July, the whole migration is over already. This resembles a bit what Samantha Franks was already telling you. This is the windows of migration of, in this case, birds wintering in the Wadden Sea region. You can see here the departure dates during spring migration. And this window is very narrow. It is only about 3 weeks of time where birds are leaving the Wadden Sea area, whereas during autumn migration, the arrival window is a bit larger, 5 to 6 weeks, with, as I said, females arriving prior to males. And this is, of course, also very important when we think of conflicts with offshore wind farms. We have only very narrow windows of arrival and departure, or of migration in general. So not a large temporal window of conflict here. And it's very interesting also to look at the diurnal patterns of migration. Like other shorebirds, curlews also migrate a lot during nighttime. So you can see at the x-axis the different hours of the day, and the columns represent the migration intensity during each of these hours of the day. And you can see that curlews also migrate a lot during the hours of daylight, but there is a peak migration intensity during the night. And this, of course, poses some threat to curlews because they can get in conflict with these illuminated structures of offshore wind farms, particularly in severe weather conditions, like in foggy nights, for instance. So let's have a look at the overlap between areas of curlew migration and offshore wind farms. So this is the situation of wind farms that we can find, or that we could find in 2022. We have most of the wind farms established so far in UK waters, Germany ranking second, and then followed by Denmark, the Netherlands, and Belgium, and then the Baltic Sea states still with very low proportions. But there's also lots of planning in the Baltic Sea. Currently, there's only 20 wind farms in operation with 420 square kilometers. But we have a planning scenario with more than 200 wind farms in the Baltic Sea, which would then cover nearly 28,000 square kilometers. And this is indicating a bit what potential conflict might arise in the future, both in the Baltic and also in the North Seas, of course. So for this part of the study, we have analyzed 118 flight tracks of 51 curlews during 2018 and until 2021, together with colleagues from France and also Estonia and Finland. What we did was to perform a home range analysis of those migration patterns. And you can see here the results for autumn migration to the left and for spring migration to the right, overlapped or overlaid with the wind farms marked in red. And the dark blue colors represent here areas with main migration intensity, and during both of these migration periods, during autumn, but also during spring, those areas are basically located mainly in the southern part of the Baltic Sea, very near to the coast, and during spring also more towards the western part of the Baltic Sea, overlapping largely with already existing wind farms. But it's of course also important to have a look on the third dimension of migration. So we wondered about the flight altitudes. And here in this map, the greenish colors represent flight altitudes of curlews that are very low and that would intersect with turbine levels. And in red and yellow, those flight altitudes represent altitudes which are far higher, up to 5,000 meters. And you can see very nicely here that the greenish colors, they dominate across the Baltic Sea, whereas the reddish and yellowish colors, they dominate across the land. And this is exactly what we could also prove statistically. Flight altitudes across the Baltic Sea were significantly lower than across the land. And the bad news is that 75% of the migration time, the curlews, they were spending it on turbine levels, so large proportion of time in potential conflict with offshore wind farms. But of course, the birds, when they approach wind farms, it is important to know what they are doing. So how they behave, are they reacting when they approach wind farms? So when we have, for instance, here, 2 different wind farm clusters off the coast of the Netherlands, and we have a bird here marked in green. So the green line here marking the GPS fixes of the birds. We can see that this bird was circumventing the first wind farm in the east, but it was crossing the second one in the west. And we now wondered if those birds would change flight directions or would change flight altitude or flight speed when they approach those wind farms. We have used a data set of about 260 tracks of 143 curlews, again with an international cooperation project, this time also including data from BTO Samantha Franks and colleagues. So how do curlews behave when they approach wind farms? So we have a given wind farm in the left of the slide here, and we have a curlew flying towards this wind farm. And we are now asking the question, what happens with the flight altitude on the y-axis when the distance to the wind farm on the x-axis is decreasing? And we modeled this now using a generalized additive model and found that during both spring and autumn migration, we had a significant increase of flight altitudes close to the wind farm, so about 400 meter, 500 meter to the wind farm, particularly during autumn. There, the birds increased their flight altitudes and fly across the wind farm and on higher altitudes than the rotor levels would be. And this can also be demonstrated in the raw data. Here we have 4 different cases of curlews crossing wind farms. In red, you can see here GPS fixes of curlews flying within a rotor height. And in green, you can see GPS fixes which represent flight heights above the rotor blades. And on all of those 4 cases, you can see when the birds are crossing the offshore wind farms, then they are above rotor heights. But of course, there could also be some behavioral reactions in the horizontal plane, and therefore we ask whether the curlews would change their flight speeds and their flight directions when they approach wind farms, so in the horizontal plane. And again, we have a curlew approaching wind farm here. On the x-axis, again, we have the distance to the offshore wind farm, and on the y-axis, we have this time not the flight altitude, but the so-called relative selection strength, which is an output from a so-called integrative step selection model. And if a model curve would meander around 1.0 here, it would mean or indicate that the curlews would not react. But we can see the opposite here. We can see a bump of this curve here at around 400 meter distance, which indicates that the birds are reacting in this distance class and that they are adjusting flight speed and also flight angle. And in other words, so the curlews start to circumvent the wind turbines at around 400 meter distance. But as you can see here as well, that the model line is not crossing the y-axis at zero, which means that some birds obviously do not react. And this is exactly what we could find out. We found regular crossing of at least a certain proportion of birds. So in 143 tagged curlews, we found in 45 of them that they were crossing wind farms without any reaction, and this makes up 32% of the tagged curlews. And again, of those 32%, 50% were crossing wind farms directly on rotor levels, so in very on levels during in very high risk. And if we would regard our tagged Curlew population as representative for the overall population of the East Atlantic flyway, then we could say that we have 16% of the entire Curlew population migrating at collision risk, and that would resemble about 120,000 individuals of the overall Curlew population. So let's sum up. I think I could show you that curlews are broad front migrants, but that we were able to identify some core areas of migration. And it's also possible to identify peak migration periods, and those are very short. They only take some days or even weeks during autumn. We also, I think we could show that avoidance leads to less collision, but it may also, of course, on the other hand, lead to energetic constraints because the birds need to circumvent the wind farms. And also, I could show that 16% of the entire population migrates at elevated risks because they do not show any behavioral response when they approach wind farms. So some recommendation for management maybe. First of all, migration hotspots, we could identify them, and one recommendation, of course, would be to keep them free whenever possible. And if wind farms should be built in those areas, then they should be arranged in a way that they are perpendicular to main migration routes and not, they should not be perpendicular, of course, to those main migration routes, but rather parallel to them. And lastly, of course, curtailment of turbines would be a mitigation measure, particularly during the peak migration, which can be identified very easily, for instance, with these type of studies like GPS data logger studies, which I have introduced to you. So with this, I want to say thank you and acknowledge lots of these co-authors that are mentioned here and which all provided their valuable data to really make possible these analyses. So thank you again for your attention.
Philip, that was absolutely fascinating, and I'm always blown away by someone doing a talk of that complexity, not in their mother tongue. So that was really, really interesting, and actually worked, I think, superbly alongside Sam's. Did all the curlews survive? Question for Sam and for Philip. Did all the study curlews survive? Was there any evidence that of collisions?
Oh yes. So Sam, if you don't mind, I can take the question first, maybe while I'm still unmuted. Well, actually, our method by checking curlews is not really the best method to quantify any casualties of curlews, because we have a delay in data transfer. As I said, we have we are receiving data via the GSM network, via the mobile phone network, but only twice a day. So there is a delay, of course, in the data recording and the data transmission. And so this is the reason why we really can't detect any casualties in real time. So it might be possible that curlews that we have a connection. Our last connection from our curlew is still in its wintering site, and when it started on its migration and would like collide with the turbine, then we just won't see it in our data, because the curlew will fall into the water and the device will not transmit any further data. So in this sense, our method is just not able to detect any casualties, really.
Thank you. And Sam, presumably that's the same with you.
Yeah, exactly. Because the transmitter, this type of transmitter, only transmits once it reaches land, because it uses the mobile phone network. If a curlew dies for some reason on migration over water, it simply just won't transmit again, but you won't know the cause of any mortality.
Okay, just one that Chris put up in the chat, and maybe I'll do a double question on this one. Chris said, do the birds behave differently if the blades are rotating or static? And I might throw in, obviously, people have been trialing one black turbine blade in the Dolomites with vultures and things. Is there any evidence that painting a turbine blade at sea makes any difference? Maybe start with Sam.
I'm going to send the question back to Philipp because definitely not my area of expertise. If my colleague were here, you could definitely answer that. I don't know for Curlews. I don't know if generally we know for Curlews.
Okay,
yeah,
Philipp.
Yes, it's a very good question, and we really urgently need to do more or to conduct more studies on differences between operating wind farms and wind farms which are not operating. So I assume that we have some data to judge this, but we haven't looked at it yet. So, but I would really assume that there are some behavioral differences when curlews approaching wind farms that are in operation and wind farms that are not, but we haven't looked at it in detail. And the second part of the question, I also know, not for curlews, but for other species, that like different color schemes of the rotor blades should really be helpful. And I also heard that like blackish, grayish colors are helpful to, for migrating birds. But for curlews, I can't say it for sure. I'm sorry.
Because I mean one of the things that you were referring to, Philipp, was this sort of mega thing of siting wind farms away from main flyways, which is obviously a huge decision. And you'd think that, and also, maybe shutting off particular turbines and wind farms at certain peaks of migration, which again is a very big decision. And the one coloured blade would be a much smaller decision. I don't know if Chris wants to add anything to this.
Can I just ask, Philipp, is there any evidence that the wind farm companies themselves are keen to work on those kinds of questions with you? I mean, because obviously there's a great deal more wealth in those organizations than there is in the research organizations. I mean, do you have creative collaboration with them over questions such as, the difference between rotating and non-rotating turbines?
Yes, it's a good question. So actually, we don't collaborate with the companies themselves, but we have multiple projects with the license authority in Germany, for instance. And all the environmental impact assessment data from the wind farm companies, they are collected by this agency, and we are able to get hold of this data and then to use this data in order to draw some conclusions on issues that I just presented, for instance. But there is, at least in Germany, there is not a strong interactions between researchers and wind farm companies, I must say. It's more via the agencies that license like new wind farm clusters in North Europe.
Yeah, I mean, the weakness in that, it seems to me, is that you're then dependent on the data that is being automatically collected, and you're not in a position to ask different questions of the wind farm companies. And it seems obvious to me, really, that we need to find a way of brokering a better relationship between the people who are investing in these projects and people like you.
Yeah, I totally agree.
There is the potential for a little bit of that in the UK. So like some of our work is funded partly by the licensing authorities, like relevant government departments, but also occasionally the commercial developers of the wind farms themselves, which genuinely sometimes approach, some of the various conservation research organizations with specific questions that they have about their operations and the potential impact on wildlife. And that might be something they're required to do, either as part of an environmental impact assessment or something that they're genuinely interested in terms of changing their practice. So it's a bit varied.
So there's a question came up in the feed from Stuart about the biggest turbine in the world is now 250 meters high, but presumably that's not an issue for a curlew, can change its height to whatever it likes. there's no limit on height as far as the curlew is concerned in avoiding something.
No, I don't think so. I mean, when we have a look at the actual flight altitude data, they are migrating up to 5 kilometers. This is of course not a limit, but yeah, of course the birds need to, or what we can see in our data at least, they are avoiding at very small scale. So I assume that they would need to start the avoidance reaction some degree earlier if the turbines also would grow, so to speak. And also, of course, we also need to think about potential energetic restraints for the curlews, because if they need to change flight altitude all the time, or if they need to circumvent turbines all the time, it's of course also a surplus of energy that they need to spend during the migration.
Is there, both of you have done all this research on the offshore wind farms? Has anyone done research on curlew migration on the onshore ones? Is there a similar research on their behaviour when they approach onshore ones, or has that not happened?
I don't know about for you, Philip, but that's something that is certainly of interest looking at some of these same data sets and looking at their interactions over land and the potential for interactions with onshore wind as well. Obviously, onshore wind construction is not as big a thing currently as it was maybe 10 or 20 years ago. And I put a couple of links in the chat with some papers by my colleague James Pierce Higgins, who was then at RSPB, who did some research looking at the impact of onshore wind developments in terms of their impact on upland breeding birds like curlews. But if it comes on the table again in terms of net zero, sort of climate change strategy and so on, it's definitely something that's on the radar for people to look at in terms of movements over land of not only curlews but other migrant birds as well.
Yeah,
go on, Philip.
Yeah, if I may add on this, maybe. So what we can see in our data is that, as I've shown, the flight altitudes are significantly higher across the land than across the sea. So there's potentially not that much collision risk across the land, but of course it depends very much on the site. So if it's sites close to like breeding sites or staging sites or resting sites, then of course the curlews would also lower their flight altitudes, and then of course we would have also higher collision risk again. But at least my institution, my group didn't do any analysis on onshore wind farms so far, but I might add like one anecdotal study that we had. We had one curlew that was approaching an onshore wind farm site, and according to the acceleration data from our GPS data loggers, we could see that this curlew suddenly dropped down to the ground, and it stayed there for 2 or 3 hours without any movement, and then suddenly went on. And we presume that this was because this bird got caught or hit by the vortex of the turbine, possibly. So this could be demonstrated with our data because it was an onshore turbine, and we can't see this in an offshore turbine, as I said, because the birds would just fall into the water and the devices would be gone.
Okay, just sort of moving on, we've got a few more minutes. Chris, I was just wondering, going back to your presentation, you're obviously a curlew lover. Do curlews specifically come into your mitigation and promotion discussions a lot? Do they come in more than they did?
No, I don't think so. I think there's much more of a general discussion about the landscape as a general issue and the broader habitat concerns. But I think as you get into the actual delivery on site, there isn't any question, I don't think, that certain species will prove to be a subject of particular focus, because obviously the real disruption with the new power lines, for instance, is in the construction and there's much debate about how much better it would be if all these cables went underground. But putting the cables underground is hugely more disturbing to the landscape in the short term. You're talking about 60-meter wide strips of disturbance through farmland, continuous strips. And obviously, the timing of that in terms of breeding curlews is absolutely crucial. And the scale of the operation is such that you can imagine it's pretty difficult to say, well, you'll have to stop for a month and a half or 2 months while the curlew nest. One of the issues that's already arising is that, ironically, the disturbance and the bare ground that's generated by that process of undergrounding is attracting nesting birds, such as little ring plovers, for instance, that are choosing to nest on the disturbed land that the engineers have created, which is a real kind of dilemma for them, because suddenly they have a protected species nesting because of their activity. So it's a complicated business, and I think really the key is that we need to know very much more, not just about the breeding sites, but I mean, what I find really interesting about the much of the current research, curlew research, is how much more we are understanding about how much more diverse their landscape requirements are than I think we ever knew. And I've been talking particularly to the guys in Bangor who are doing the work in North Wales. And now that we understand more about where curlews go at night, this is completely changing the view of the role of different elements of the landscape. So we need much more information, really, about where we might be doing damage to their broad range of territories. Because, the assumption was, well, it's the nesting sites and maybe the estuary feeding sites, but it's much more complicated than that, as most people who are listening this evening probably already know.
And I think, as you and I were talking this morning about, there is so much that we don't know. And we don't know, just taking the conversation wider away from curlews and looking at renewable and how it affects biodiversity, there are some really surprising gains coming out that people didn't. I mean, maybe just do the one you were talking about this morning, Chris.
Yeah, well, I was interested in the fact, I asked the question about the relationship with the industry. The whole relationship is predicated, it seems to me, on the industry being constantly told to minimize the damage that they do, which is fine, and we need to keep saying that to industry generally. But there's never a conversation about the creativity that they could generate. And so if you take the wind farm constructions on the seabed, there is almost no discussion about the base of those structures being designed as artificial reefs, for instance, actively designed as artificial reefs. And that could be a significant resource for inshore fisheries and crustacean production, for instance. Again, really interesting work in Bangor on the scope there is within the shallow sea wind farms for mussel and oyster farming. And the floating wind farm, wind turbines that are beginning to appear in the Irish Sea, for instance. Bangor, again, discovering that those structures tethered to the seabed are actually having a churning effect, which is proving beneficial in that it's breaking the layering, which at the moment is stagnant. It seems to be stagnant because of climate change, that the cold water from the low levels is being brought back up to the surface in a way that it traditionally would have happened. And that seems to be stimulating oxygen content and fish stocks. So there's so much that's happening out there that is starved of serious research. And I'm absolutely certain that we should be building that research ethos into the companies. I mean, apart from anything else, they have structures out there that could accommodate laboratories, for instance, if anybody ever thought to ask them.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's probably quite a good time to start winding this up. I know we always try to do that by 8. On a note of optimism, that we all look at the problems, and then sort of slowly as the thing develops, we see opportunities, and we see things going right, like sort of kittiwake nesting platforms on new turbines and all the rest of it. I think it's probably what all these webinars have in common is the need to learn more and sort of park forming an opinion until we sort of know a bit more, because it's a fascinating one. Could go on one could go on all night with this one, but we won't. So what I will do is just say to the speakers, any final, before we wrap it up, any final points you'd like to make, starting with Chris?
No, I think I've made all the points I need to make. Thanks. I've enjoyed it very much.
Right, and Sam?
Yeah, it's been really nice to speak tonight. It's not an area that is necessarily sort of the core of my expertise, but obviously there's a lot of potential for the implications of renewable energy on Curlews going forward.
Well, it looked pretty close to the core of your expertise from my perspective. And finally, Philip.
Mary says hard to be optimistic about the Wash Barrage. Well, from a personal opinion, I completely agree with you, Mary. But also from a personal opinion, I am highly skeptical that it will go forward. The ecological implications are just too great, and the economic costs of development, I think, are too great. That's not to say that tidal development on other estuaries isn't entirely feasible, equally estuaries which are also very important for Curlews. So we should not lose sight of that.
Thank you, Sam. And finally, Philip, any last word?
Yeah, so thanks again for inviting me. It was a pleasure to have the option to present to you some of our results. And I think what, out of my point of view, or just as a summary, I think what brings us really a step further is really to use big data. So when we compile lots of data of researchers doing the same things as we have tried also in our studies, I think we can really nail some points down more nicely and get a better overall picture. So that would be my plea, to really form kind of cooperations with other researchers working on the same topics.
Right. Now, and I know there's still people trying to ask questions. Keep putting them in the chat after the thing is finished, because we will try and answer them all. But I think in the time we had, we've done the best we can. I'm hugely grateful to the three speakers, all of them, and just a little bit extra for Sam for breaking off and stopping her daughter watching whatever it was she was wanting to watch. It's absolutely fascinating, and I just hope that it gives everyone the momentum to go on and do their own research and look for more. Thank you all for attending. I hope it's been a great use of your evening, and it's been lovely having you. And I'm just going to hand over to Megan to close us up, and then we'll tell you about the next one. Megan.
Hello everyone. Thank you again all for attending. I really appreciate you taking your time out of your evenings to attend this. We will be having another webinar in mid-February. The topic will be on diets of curlews. That will be on the website shortly, so you can sign up for it. And the recording of this webinar will be available on the YouTube channel shortly as well. And I think that rounds it up for the evening. Thank you again.